Okay, so isometric perspective. Um, there's a handout on page 5 of that packet I gave you. So if at any point you get lost, or if you're at home and you're trying to do it, you can refer back to this. The first thing you should do is when you start to open a new document, since this is only going to be digital, we'll use the web setting. So under new document profile, choose web, and you'll need to change the size here. So your final map is going to be 1280 by 800. And you don't have to add a bleed. I think it's kind of a good idea to get into the habit of using one though. So maybe you put a 10 pixel bleed, just so that way if you have information going all the way to the edge, you can make sure that when you save it out that there's no weird white lines that appear because you didn't take it far enough to the edge. Keep the color mode at RGB. You can switch the raster effect to 150 pixels per inch. Sometimes if you do 72 and then you decide you want to go print it out, it's going to be very pixelated. So if you keep it at 150, that kind of gives you the option to print it out and make it look a little bit crisper. So I've got my artboard here set up and ready to go. I'm going to bring up my rulers. Pretty much anytime I will do a document in Illustrator, I'll bring up the rulers. So I do that by pressing Command R. And then I'm going to make sure I have my layers open so I can see what layers I'm working with. I'm going to change the stroke color to something you guys can see. When you guys are working, you'll probably want to change the stroke color to something more subtle. Let's say you're getting ready to print this out. You probably want to print it at like a 50 to 25% gray, so that way you can still draw on top of it and see your drawing over it. But just so you guys can see what I'm doing on the screen, I'm going to put it on magenta. The very first thing I'm going to do is grab my line segment tool, and I'm just going to do a bunch of vertical lines. I want to start somewhere outside of my artboard, and for this whole process I want everything to be bigger than my artboard, because when I flip stuff around I want to make sure that my grid is actually completely covering my artboard and actually going a little bit beyond it. So I'm just going to start somewhere over here on the left, hold down Shift and make a straight line. And then I'm going to hold down Option so I get the double arrows, hold down Shift again, and just drag that line to the right so it duplicates. Then I'm just going to go directly to duplicate these lines all the way across. So I'm going to do Command D. And if I hold it down, it just keeps duplicating all the way across. Whoops. And if I want to go ahead and extend these lines a little bit, I just have to select all of them and then drag those up or down a little bit more. So this is my first layer. I'm just going to call this vertical lines. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I can duplicate it either by going to this drop down menu and going to duplicate line, or I can click and drag it to the new layer icon and it duplicates it. I'm going to turn the original vertical line layer off, and I'm going to name this layer 60 degree lines. And if I don't have these lines selected, I need to go ahead and select them. Then I'm going to go to the transform menu, and in this angle window, I'm going to put in 60 degrees and press enter. So it's going to shift all those lines 60 degrees. Then I'm going to go back to my layers and turn off the visibility on that layer. I'll turn the vertical lines back on, and I'm going to duplicate that layer again. And this layer is going to be negative 60 degree lines. I'm going to select all of those lines again, go to transform, do negative 60, and it shifts them the other direction. So now I can go back and turn all of those lines on. And when I zoom in, I can see that I'm getting that diamond shape that's typical of isometric grids. The vertical lines, I want every point where two lines meet for there to be a vertical line going through it. So what I might have to do is lock the rest of the other layers and just focus on the vertical line layer. And see if I can shift those lines over so that they intersect with all of the diagonal lines that are made. Yeah. So now what I have is I have all of these equilateral triangles. Now once you've done this, you can see the area that's made is pretty big, so maybe I decide I want my grids to be smaller. So I can unlock all of these layers, do select all, and reduce the size. And so now I've got a lot more little units to work with. But that's why I wanted to go ahead and, make those lines pretty long, because by doing that, I get more of an area where all three of those lines overlap, and I can shift it around over my artboard more easily. So are there any questions about that? Okay, so I can keep these layers if I want to. I would recommend going ahead and keeping them just in case you want to edit anything. Like I've said before, I'm kind of a pack rat when it comes to working in Illustrator. I don't really throw anything away. But what I'm going to do next is I'm going to select all of these lines and actually turn them into guides. You all might know that if you go to View, you can turn on different grids. The grid that you would typically see is this standard square grid. And that's the only default, the only type of grid that Illustrator, at least in this version, will give you. But what I want to do is be able to have guides based on this isometric perspective. So I'm going to select all of these lines and go to View, go down to Guides, and then there's this option called Make Guides. So when I do that, it takes all of these lines and transforms them into actual guides. And these are guides that I can hide when I hit Command semicolon, so I can turn them off and on. Or if I change the visibility of the layer, that also turns them on and off. Since I have these in separate layers, I can turn off each type of angled line. What it did that I didn't want it to do, though, is it took away the existing line. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to duplicate these first and lock them. And now I'll make separate guides. So I'm going to go to View, once again, Guides, Make Guides. And now I still have my original lines and then the grid lines. If I don't really care about being able to separate the guides by angle or anything, I can just go ahead and select all these layers and merge them. So if I use this drop-down menu, I can go down to Merge Selected Layers, and it'll put all those in one layer. So I can call this Guides, and then be able to change the visibility that way. If I want to change the color of the guides, I can double click on the layer. Wait a minute. Actually, to change the guides, I think I have to go to Preferences. So I'm going to change the color so you guys can see it, because I think the cyan is a little tough to see. I'm going to leave this layer alone. I'm going to lock that so I can't mess with it. And then any artwork I want to make, I'm going to put in a new layer. So kind of like in previous projects, so I don't mess with certain things. In terms of making shapes, probably the easiest approach is to use the pen tool. Because especially if you have smart guides on, you can click. Actually, let me make sure smart guides are on. You can click and it'll tell you where you're intersecting with certain points. And just make it a little bit easier to follow the grid. So a shape like this looks like a diamond, but in this perspective, it's actually a perfect square. Alternatively, let's say this, I'm making kind of a city block. Maybe I want a building that's a little bit wider. Could follow the same kind of length as the first block, but then extend the width a little bit more. Then to build things up, what I can do is duplicate these two shapes and bring them up a little bit. And then I can use the pen tool or the line segment tool to create lines that connect these different shapes. For things like spheres or ovals, I can use the ellipse tool and still use the grid as a guide. Now, in isometric perspective, if I want to create a circle, the main thing to keep in mind is it needs to be touching at least 4 sides within one of these diamond shapes. So it'll probably take a little bit of practice, but let's say I'm trying to make a circle within this 4-block square. I'm forming the oval so that it touches each side of that square once. So let's say I were to take a shape like this, kind of as a guide. The circle is touching each one of those sides. Then to make a cylinder, I would do the same type of thing that I would do with an elongated rectangle. I would duplicate the bottom part of that shape, and then I can use the pen tool or maybe even the rectangle tool. In this case, I'll use the Pathfinder tool to actually form the top and the bottom of the cylinder, and I'll connect the diameters of both of these ellipses, and then I'm going to select these shapes and then go get my shape builder tool. The top part obviously would just be one cylinder or one circle, so I'll merge those together, and then this bottom part would be, I'm going to move this away. This bottom part, the bottom oval would be obstructed, so I'll merge this outer edge with that whole oval on the bottom, and then I get this cylinder shape. Like I was saying before with one of the illustration examples, things like a sphere, I could make a perfect circle and then use vector shapes with to create areas of highlight and shadow. So maybe I make this my shadow area and then make another little shape for the highlight. And I can use the shape builder tool once again to cut out this area where the shadow is. And change the colors around. So that makes it look a little bit more dimensional. Of course, you guys would make it look better than that, but that's the gist of it. I mentioned before you can take things like type and kind of skew them, or even if you have any other type of shape, you could start off with just whatever typeface you want to use. And convert it to outlines so that it's a vector shape. And then you've got these tools over here. You've got the free transform tool, and then you've got some other tools. The one you would want to work with is the shear tool. And so that will move whatever the object is according to certain axes within your document. So your goal here would be to shift the shape so that it works within the 30, 60, 90 worlds that you're working with. So if you do it with the tool, you can kind of be more free form with it. I believe you can also use object and transform and shear, and then try adjusting the angles that way. Oops, that's not right. So this way you can just put in a standard angle and kind of mess with it. So in this one I put in 30 degrees to the vertical axis and it automatically shifted it. And you could technically do that with any shape you have. So let's say you're trying to build a house. I could use the pen tool to maybe draw the house. And then instead of trying to figure out how those angles work in isometric perspective, I could go to transform, shear, and use the same settings I had before and just automatically shift it to where it needs to be. And then if I want the other side, I could duplicate it and transform it. Let's see. In a different way. Actually, let's do it like this. To get the second side. So if you're kind of struggling with how all of this would get translated, this is kind of one way to do it. There's a couple of samples that I can post to D2L. These are kind of ways to show you how you could take a two-dimensional shape and kind of fit it into the 3D perspective of the isometric grid. So in this one, the artist started out with a two-dimensional map and then used a grid he created that's in isometric perspective and adapted these shapes into that perspective. And then over here, we see how he's drawn in different parts of it. One thing I'll say with this is that you don't have to necessarily create all of this with the pen tool. If you want to, you're more than welcome to print out the grid and put tracing paper on top of it and draw with a pen or pencil and scan that in and color it like we have with other things, so using live paint or the brush tool. That's totally fine. The main requirement for this is that you use the isometric perspective. I guess if you wanted to, you could even shift the angles a little bit. So maybe you want to have it more like 25 and 60. I haven't tried that before. This kind of breaks down the perspective more easily, and this is what you would typically see for isometric. But the main thing is that it should be that idealized perspective. Then this other one here is something that maybe you bring in to the grid you're working in. And I'll make a new layer and put it in there. But this just shows different types of shapes that you might want to try to make just to get a better feel for the grid. So the top ones are a lot more simple. It's basically rectangles and squares, just shaped different ways. The ones down here are a bit more complicated in that it's taking some kind of cut out of those basic rectangle shapes. But what you might want to do is try to emulate some of these shapes in the grid that you've created. So, for example, this number 9, at the top it would be a basic rectangle, but then the side comes up and maybe I start out by building this basic rectangle for the other side and then figure out this kind of bottom edge. And then the front part, so I'm going to use the pen tool to connect all of these sides together. And I'm realizing right now one of these things is kind of off. It should be 3 wide, so I'm going to move that. And then make another shape to connect this one. And then see if I can use the shape builder tool to merge this front side. If at any time while you're working you realize that some stuff is not aligning to the grid, the easiest thing to do is either use the direct selection tool or the lasso tool and select just the points you want to move. So I'm just clicking and dragging over these points and then moving them to the part of the grid that they should be on. And then if there's some points that aren't straight, maybe they're supposed to be perfectly horizontal or perfectly vertical, I can select those and use the align tools up here and align those just like I would any other set of vector shapes within the software. As you're working, especially if you're going to be working with strokes, you'll want to keep in mind the way the strokes are overlapping one another. Right now I have all of the strokes aligned to center, so the strokes fall evenly on either side of the path. And so that way, as long as the paths are overlapping one another perfectly, all of the lines will look like they're the same width. Obviously this line right here isn't lined up perfectly, so it looks wider. If I change it, and let's say I do a line to the inside, then any lines that are close to one another are going to create this thicker line. There might be times when you want that to happen. More than likely, if you do that, it's probably an accident though. So that's just something to keep in mind. The same thing could happen if you do a line to the outside. Another thing you should think about if you're using the strokes is what happens at corners. So right now these two corners line up perfectly, but since they have these points, it's making this weird shape at the ends where they overlap. So to fix that, I'm going to select those shapes and change the corner. Usually if I just change it to the rounded corner, it'll fix everything and make it look smoother. So yeah, that's probably the easiest fix. I think bevel works sometimes, but not always. You can see there it kind of took a bite out of the corner, and I don't really want that. So generally speaking, the rounded corner option is the best way to go. Okay. Are there any questions about the basic aspects of the isometric perspective? If you want to print this out, which really you guys all should, so you can practice drawing outside of the computer with the grid, you can go back to the original grid you created and change the line color. So maybe I'll change this to a gray. And when I go to print it, just change the size to whatever size paper I need to print it out on. So with this one, it's going to keep all of the scales the same. If I do obviously fit to page, it's going to take my artboard and fit it to the page. So pretty simple. Yeah.
Question about the type. I noticed like theirs were really dimensional. The ones that you showed us, how did they get that effect? Did they drag it like you did the house?
Yeah. So to do that, and I would say if you want to do that type of thing where it looks dimensional, you probably wouldn't want to use a typeface that has a lot of curves to it because it's going to be tougher to figure out, but it's definitely possible. The best way to do it would be to duplicate this and bring it out behind the shape. Maybe I'll make this one a different color so I can just tell which is which. Try to use the pen tool to connect parts of these shapes. So I'm going to start over here with the P just because it's easier. So forming the top of this, actually this shape behind it isn't on the right perspective. Okay, there we go. Let's see.
If we can, do we need to find a way where it lines up really well on like the 60-degree lines to do this?
Say that again?
To make it a little bit easier to make sure it's proportionate, do we need to find like a 60-degree line somewhere where they both line up correctly?
Yeah. So that's what I just did. I moved them both. So I'm looking at the A right here, that point, and I put each of them onto a point on the grid, so that made it easier. So now if I try to connect these, it should be in the right perspective, yeah. So I would go through and start to form that third dimension. With any faces that I would actually see. Things like the curves here, you could use the pen tool and make the curve yourself, or what you could do is duplicate the shape and cut it apart using the scissors tool so that it's more accurate. But even this shape, once I get that curve, I can duplicate that and bring it up to the other P. And of course I would make this better. And what I could do now is take the direct selection tool and just select the 2 points I want to join together and do Command J, and it joins those 2 points together. This bottom one I'd have to adjust a little bit because the way that would connect is not as far as I put there originally. I'm going to clip it there and clip this one here. And then I'm going to take these 2 points, Command J, and join those together. So that's how you would do that. So like another way I was saying that you could change these so maybe that curve is a little bit more accurate. I'm going to expand both of these and ungroup them. And I'm going to copy this P, paste it in front, and then I'm going to use my scissor tool to chop this letter so I can get that curve. Then I'll duplicate it, put it back where it would be on the other letter. And then do the same thing I did before. Find the points that need to be joined together. And you can select both of them as long as you hold down Shift, Command J to join them. Same for these two down here. And then I get that curve. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Yeah.
When it comes to the grid, can we make it as small, like the spacing between them as small as we want to?
Yeah.
Or can we just set it up correctly?
Yeah. I think on the sheet I say to use a certain increment, but really you can use any increment you want. Just as long as you duplicate the layers and you don't mess with any of the lines, it should be fairly easy to make the grid.
You could also just go to the rectangular grid tool and turn off vertical or horizontal, and then that will evenly space everything.
Yeah. One other thing that you might want to try is you can go to Preferences and Grids and Guides. Or wait, which one is it? Oh, it's Smart Guides. You can use construction angles. If you turn this on and then change the angles here, so if you do 30 degrees, supposedly it should work to where everything gets moved within 30 degrees of one another. It takes some getting used to, but sometimes that makes it a little bit easier to kind of fit stuff to the grid. Let me see if I can make this work. If you hold down Shift, it's still going to go to the 90 and 45 degree angles. But it's supposed to kind of help with when you actually put down angles and rotate them and stuff. But if you want to, that's kind of an option that you might want to explore. Any other questions? Okay.